Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Lee. I currently work as an admissions consultant. I previously worked for the UBC Sauder School of Business as a recruitment and admissions manager. I worked in higher education in total for about 6 years. What's also inspirational to me was the idea that these people, typically both domestic and international students, but especially international students, were moving to Canada to make a new life for themselves. And my own parents were immigrants. I come from an immigrant background. Both of my parents were refugees during the Vietnam War. So the idea of being able to help people move to Canada or carving a new path for themselves was very inspiring to me. And it's what spurred on my work working with students right now in admissions. A lot of students, especially when they're starting that journey of looking at universities in Canada, is what's the secret sauce? What is the thing that all Canadian universities are looking for in students? And it's not just one secret ingredient. There's not one secret X factor that we look for within a student that will guarantee you admissions into a university. It is a combination of different factors. So it's grades, obviously, it's how you articulate yourself in your personal statement, it's the extracurriculars that you work on, it's the overall general profile that you provide over to a university. Another thing also about working with students is a lot of times they ask me, what's the best way that I can craft a personal statement? And I always like to tell students that institutions in general, when they're looking for students, they're really looking for that personal touch. So in anything that you provide over to the institution, whether it's an admissions personal essay, whether it's your resume, we're looking for something uniquely you. What a good personal essay should talk about is the resilience. What are some challenges or obstacles that you've had in your life? And what are some ways that you're dealing with them right now? Or if you have managed to overcome them, what are some obstacles? I think it's important to acknowledge your background. I think it's important to acknowledge the challenges that you've had and then being able to talk about how you've overcome some of those challenges, or maybe what are some ways that you're still overcoming those challenges. When we're talking about like extracurriculars, maybe you haven't been able to participate in extracurriculars because you have to work on the side. And that's okay. I think that's a really important thing to point out. That could be a challenge for you. I haven't been able to participate in as many after school clubs, or I haven't been able to volunteer as much because I've had to work, because I've had to support my family. And I think being able to discuss some of those gaps that you think that the typical admissions essay would want to go into is really important. I think being able to acknowledge that, being able to talk about these things would actually enhance your profile quite a bit because it then shows us that, okay, you have an idea of what we would want of a typical profile, but then you're able to bring in your own life experiences and edge to that. Being able to acknowledge that is really important, to acknowledge that maybe there were struggles that you had, maybe there were perhaps mental health issues, or maybe there were personal issues that you didn't get to articulate in other parts of your profile. Typically, with institutions, they will always have an essay where you can add in more information that maybe other questions or standard questions didn't get to touch on. And I would say that's the space to articulate that. Transparency is very important. I think students sometimes shy away from talking about, as I mentioned before, some of those challenges that they've had because they might think it might put a mark on their application. Or maybe one common thing that we typically see is when students don't talk about maybe the F's on their resume or the fails on their transcript because they're worried that by bringing it up, the admissions manager is just going to focus on that. There usually is a very good reason why you may not have done as well. Maybe they had family issues. Maybe they had personal things that the administration didn't know about or didn't mark down on their transcript. So that transparency is probably something I would advise students to lean more into rather than trying to hide it because the admissions team is going to see everything. So by being able to explore some of that in your essays or personal statements, that would be a recommendation I would have. Another mistake I usually see students dive a little too much into is trying to be too much of an influencer in how they speak. So I think if we go on LinkedIn, sometimes we see the way people articulate some of their stories and it doesn't come off as genuine. Or maybe sometimes people put things into ChatGPT and AI will just produce a very standardized type of response or essay. Try as hard as you can to really write things in your voice. Obviously, if you want to put things through ChatGPT to check for grammar issues or shortening statements down, that's perfectly valid to do. But don't type in a bullet list into ChatGPT or anything or any other AI tools and expect to produce something in a genuine voice. So that's the second thing I would recommend students to look upon, and that's a mistake I typically see in essays. The third thing that I would recommend to students is to stay on topic and stay on track in your personal statements or your essays. I once got this advice from an admissions manager that I was working alongside with at another institution. And they said that you should be able to provide the essay, just the essay, not the prompt, to someone else, a third party like a family member or a friend. And by reading that essay, they should then be able to articulate what the prompt is or what the question is without knowing what it is. And if they align, that means that the essays that you're writing are right on topic. If there's too much distracting information, if you're adding in too many tangents into your essays, that can distract from what the original prompt is. And that can be very hard for admissions managers to assess what you're trying to say. They're usually looking for just a very strongly worded reply to the prompt. Anything that's tangential to that can be a bit distracting for admissions team members. It's not just the admissions manager who's looking at this. It typically is a complete committee. So you'll get very different voices commenting on the profile itself too. A lot of the times when admissions teams are going through large numbers of essays, they'll try to take out as many kind of personable, identifiable information as possible. So we're trying to reduce bias as much as possible. There's no pure formula. It's not like you can punch in, your grade point average, punch in the assessment of the interview or the essays, and you get a final number, and they're either in or they're not. Especially with broad-based admissions, there's a lot of discussion that goes on behind whether a student makes it into a university or not. Now, to your question around essays and the grades and which one is valued, I would say that the grades are the grades, right? You can't go back and change anything about that. You can't go to your high school teachers and try to bump up those marks. You could definitely try to retake the course, but usually that's a rarity. In which case, if you're a little bit worried about your grades, then you really need to focus on the personal statement and the essays, because they can tell a lot about your story that your grades may not be able to touch on. So again, if you didn't do as well in 1 year for whatever reason, let's say that a family member had passed away, write that into your essay. Talk about maybe what happened when your marks dipped and what you did. What was the lesson that you learned from that? Was it perhaps emotional resilience? Did you perhaps learn how to handle stress better? Was it maybe reaching out to people and letting them know about your struggles earlier than later so that you can better prepare yourself? There's a lesson learned right there. And so I think that the personal statement, as someone who used to work in admissions, I pay a lot of attention to that personal statement. And I would argue that the personal statement can definitely enhance your profile more than you think it does. So do pay attention to that. Craft a very strongly worded personal statement, stay on topic. And I would say that's a key to strong admission sometimes, especially if you're worried about the grades. The grades are a very critical part of the admissions process, but again, there's not much you can typically do about the grades once you've received them. So that's when I would say you might want to focus on the personal statement more so than anything.